Radical Islam did not invade Bangladesh. It was handed an open door. On August 5th, 2024, the government collapsed in a single afternoon. The prime minister climbed into a helicopter and fled to India. Within weeks, a banned Islamist party was legal again. Convicted militant leaders walked out of prison on bail, and the minorities who had sheltered under the old order found no one left to call. This is the biggest opening that Islamist networks have had in Bangladesh in 50 years. And the people who opened the door called themselves reformers. Here is what makes the story so strange. It did not happen during a war or under some dictator seizing power. No, it happened during what millions of Bangladeshis believed was their moment of liberation. A youth-led revolution that toppled an autocrat and promised a cleaner, freer country. The hope was real. The crowds were real. And so was what crept in behind them. A nation of more than 175 million people, one of the largest Muslim-majority countries on Earth, spent the next 18 months discovering that removing a strongman is the easy part. What fills the space afterward is the part that nobody can control. Some of what filled it wanted democracy. Some of it wanted something very different. And for a year and a half, the two were almost impossible to tell apart. So how does a country built on a secular constitution, known mostly to the outside world for cheap clothing and not much else, become a place where a man can be beaten to death over a Facebook post while the government waves away the outrage as just fake news? Well, step by step. That's the only way it ever happens. Let's start with the country that existed before any of this began. Bangladesh was never a comfortable place to govern. It was an impossible one. You pack more than 170 million people into a landmass smaller than the American state of Iowa, and you get the most crowded country on Earth that is not a city-state. Density runs past 1,200 people per square kilometer. Dhaka, the capital, swells by hundreds of thousands of new arrivals every year. Most of them rural families pushed off land that the rivers are slowly eating. 2/3 of the country sits barely above sea level, so when the monsoon comes, a third of it can vanish underwater. For millions of people, that's not an abstraction. Whole villages along the great rivers are eaten alive each year as the banks crumble into the water, forcing families to pack up and move again and again. Most of them wash up in the slums of Dhaka, adding to a capital already bursting at every seam. The country runs a permanent low-grade refugee crisis inside its own borders, and it's done so for decades. The air is its own emergency. Dhaka is ranked among the most polluted major cities on the globe, with fine particle pollution running many times above what the World Health Organization considers safe. Researchers estimate that the dirty air alone shaves years off the average life. People do not pour into Dhaka because it's livable. They pour in because the alternative is worse. And holding the whole thing up, the entire economy really, is one industry: garments. Cheap clothing sewn for European and North American brands account for more than 80% of the country's exports and employs roughly 4 million workers, most of them young women. That's the engine. It also is the only engine, so when it stalls, there's no backup. And the people packed inside this machine are overwhelmingly young. Bangladesh is a nation of under 30s, millions of them pouring into the workforce every year, into an economy that cannot possibly absorb them all. The jobs that exist are the punishing kind: 12-hour shifts on a factory floor for wages that barely cover rent and rice. A whole generation was growing up educated, online, and quietly furious, watching a small elite prosper while the rivers swallowed their villages and the air filled their lungs. That fury was the dry tinder, and it only needed a spark. Now this matters because a country with no slack has no margin for chaos. A wealthier state can absorb a political shock, a bad election, a sudden resignation, and keep the lights on. But Bangladesh could not. Every institution was already running at the red line. The police were stretched thin. The courts answered to power. The civil service served whoever happened to be holding the reins. So when power suddenly vanished, there was nothing underneath to catch the fall. For 15 years, one person has held all of it together by force. Her name was Sheikh Hasina. And in the summer of 2024, the students who had grown up under her rule decided that they had finally had enough. What happened next began as one of the most hopeful uprisings in the country's history. But it did not end that way. It started over jobs. Sheikh Hasina had ruled for 15 unbroken years, winning election after election that observers increasingly dismissed as hollow. Opposition leaders were jailed, critical newspapers were squeezed. The January 2024 vote that handed her a fourth straight term was held with no credible opposition on the ballot at all. To her supporters, she was the woman who had delivered roads, power plants, and steady economic growth. To a rising generation, she was simply the only ruler that they had ever known, and the living symbol of a system rigged against them. In June 2024, students poured into the streets to protest a quota system that reserved a larger share of government posts for the families of war veterans, a setup that they saw as rigged patronage for the ruling party. It was a narrow grievance, but Hasina's response turned it into something far bigger. Her security forces opened fire. The United Nations later estimated that more than 600 people were killed as the crackdown escalated through July and into August. Some counts ran even higher. The images of dead students did what no opposition party had managed in 15 years. They united the country against her. By the first days of August, the protests had become a full national revolt. The military refused to keep firing on crowds. And on August 5th, 2024, Sheikh Hasina boarded a helicopter and fled to India, ending a 15-year grip on power in just a matter of hours. Now, for a moment, it looked like a clean victory. Crowds filled the streets. A Nobel Peace Prize winner, the economist Muhammad Yunus, was brought in to lead an interim government. The young people who had driven the uprising spoke of a new Bangladesh: secular, fair, accountable. They drafted a sweeping reform agenda, later called the July Charter, full of promises about term limits, clean institutions, and equal citizenship for everyone. Now, this is the part that the angry headlines always skip. The 2024 uprising was not an Islamist revolution. It was, at its heart, a democratic one. The faces on the front lines were students, not clerics. The demands were about jobs and justice, not religious law. But revolutions, well, they don't get to choose who walks through the door that they kick open. Because alongside the idealistic students stood other, far more disciplined organizations. Groups that had spent years banned, jailed, even driven underground. Groups with command structures, funding networks, and a patience that the students could not match. They had been waiting a very long time for a moment exactly like this one. And the new government, in its first weeks, was about to hand them everything that they wanted. The interim government's first major moves did not target the extremists, they freed them. Let's start with the biggest one. On August 28, 2024, just over 3 weeks after Hasina fled, the new government lifted the ban on Jamaat-e-Islami, the country's largest Islamist party. Hasina had outlawed it in her final days in power. The interim government, well, they reversed her, arguing that the ban had been politically motivated and unsupported by any real evidence of terrorism. By June 2025, the Supreme Court went further and restored the party's electoral registration outright, clearing it to contest elections for the first time in over a decade. Now, to understand why that alarms so many Bangladeshis, you have to know what Jamaat-e-Islami actually is. Founded in 1941, it had opposed the very creation of Bangladesh, siding with the Pakistani army during the 1971 War of Independence, and helping to organize militias accused of mass atrocities. Now, decades later, a special tribunal convicted and hanged several of its top leaders for those crimes. This was not a party with a merely checkered past. This was a party whose founders had been executed for crimes against the nation itself, now restored to full legal life. That was the front door. The back door was quieter. According to the European Union Agency for Asylum, drawing on Bangladesh's own prison records, 174 inmates linked to militant outfits were released on bail between August and December 2024. Among them were key figures from banned terrorist groups, including, by those accounts, the leader of Ansar al-Islam. Now that name matters. Ansar al-Islam had made itself notorious in the previous decade by hacking secular and atheist bloggers to death in the streets of Dhaka with machetes, a campaign that terrorized the country's writers and freethinkers into silence or exile. Its leadership was now walking back out into a society whose police had all but stopped functioning. And then there was the third door, the one that didn't need to be unlocked at all. Hafazat-e-Islam. A vast network of religious schools and hardline clerics did not need a court ruling or a bail order. It simply moved into that vacuum. Analysts tracking this period describe a clear resurgence of Islamist organizing from August 2024 onward, with groups coordinating openly in ways that the old government would have never tolerated. Hafazat was no stranger to the streets. Back in 2013, it had flooded central Dhaka with hundreds of thousands of supporters, demanding blasphemy laws and the punishment of secular bloggers, in a show of force that rattled the entire country. Crushed and sidelined in the years that followed, it now found the pressure lifted all at once, facing a government with neither the will nor the muscle to push back. Now here's the part we're sitting on. None of this was an invasion. There were no foreign fighters pouring across a border. Every one of these doors was opened from the inside, by a government that believed it was correcting the abuses of a dictatorship. In trying to be fair, it removed a cage, and it built nothing to replace it. The consequences did not stay confined to politics. They spilled into the street, into culture, into the texture of ordinary life. And that is where ordinary Bangladeshis first felt the ground shift beneath them. The change did not announce itself with a coup. It showed up in small, telling moments. In January 2025, in a rural district, a girls' soccer match was canceled after hundreds of protesters stormed the field, declaring the event un-Islamic. A football game, right? Or soccer if you're American. The kind of ordinary thing that had gone unremarked for years, well, that was suddenly a battleground. And the people objecting to it won. Across the country, attacks on Sufi shrines multiplied. Now, Sufism is a mystical, music-loving strain of Islam woven deep into Bangladeshi culture for centuries, and that was treated by hardliners as heresy. Shrines that had stood for generations were vandalized and burned. This was not extremists targeting another religion. This was one version of Islam trying to erase an older one that had lived there far longer. Now, meanwhile, the most powerful clerical network in the country started issuing demands and expected them to be met. Hafazat-e-Islam called for the abolition of a government commission on women's rights, objecting to its language on equal inheritance. It pushed for hundreds of criminal cases against its own leaders and activists to be dropped. These were not fringe petitions shouted into the void. They came from a movement that now understood exactly how much leverage it suddenly held. The fight over women's rights became the clearest signal of all. When the interim government floated reforms to give women more equal standing in inheritance and family law, the backlash was immediate and organized. Mass rallies demanded the proposals be scrapped. And for a country whose 4 million garment workers, the backbone of the entire economy, are mostly women, a movement openly hostile to women in public life was not a fringe curiosity. It was a threat aimed straight at the engine room. Rights monitors also recorded rising violence and intimidation aimed at gay and transgender people, and at secular writers, the same kinds of voices that had been hunted a decade earlier. The atmosphere that the old regime had suppressed by force was now seeping back, and the new government seemed unwilling or simply unable to stop it. And for the average Bangladeshi, the message was quiet but unmistakable. The boundaries of what you could wear, watch, play, and say were being redrawn. Not by a law passed in parliament, but by the loudest and most organized people in any given room. And the state kept looking the other way. But there's a group that felt this shift not as a change in atmosphere, but as a threat to their lives. For the country's religious minorities, this vacuum was never abstract. This has a body count. And the people who paid first and paid most were the Hindus. Bangladesh's Hindu minority makes up a little under 8% of their population, a community that's been shrinking for decades and that had largely aligned for protection with Hasina's ostensibly secular party. But when that party collapsed, the alignment that once offered shelter now turned into a target painted on their backs. In the days after August 5th, 2024, the violence came quickly. Homes were burned, temples desecrated, shops were looted. The country's main minority rights group, the Hindu, Buddhist, and Christian Unity Council, would go on to document more than 2,000 incidents of communal violence in the months that followed, including dozens of killings and roughly 95 attacks on places of worship. Now, here is where we have to slow down and be careful, because this is exactly where the propaganda machines on both sides went to work. The government insisted that most of these attacks were political revenge against Hasina's allies rather than religious persecution. Bangladeshi police, reviewing nearly 1,800 reported attacks, classified the overwhelming majority as politically motivated and only a small handful as communal. Indian social media, meanwhile, flooded the internet with exaggerated and sometimes outright fabricated footage. The United Nations Human Rights Office landed somewhere in between, finding the violence was driven by a tangle of motives at once: religious hatred, political revenge, and old disputes over land. But you strip away that statistical fight, and you're left with cases that need no spin at all. On December 18, 2025, in Gazipur, near the capital, a 27-year-old Hindu garment worker named Deepu Chandra Das was accused by Muslim colleagues of insulting the Prophet Muhammad in a post. A mob came for him at his workplace. They beat him to death, hung his body from a tree, and then set it on fire. Across the country, Hindus watched the footage on their phones in silence. 13 days later, in another district, a 50-year-old Hindu businessman named Kokan Chandra Das was stopped on a rural road, attacked with sharp weapons, doused in gas, and then set on fire. He survived only by throwing himself into a pond. And a Hindu spiritual leader, Chinmoy Krishna Das, who had spoken up for his community, was arrested in November 2024 on a sedition charge and left to sit in jail, repeatedly denied bail for many months afterward. His arrest drew condemnation from international religious freedom watchdogs and inflamed the Hindu diaspora abroad. And the fear rippled far past the headline cases. A United States government commission on religious freedom reported that Hindu women in some regions had quietly stopped wearing the bindis and bangles that marked them out, hoping to pass unnoticed. The Great Durga Puja festival, normally a riot of colors and crowds, was scaled back in places out of fear of who the celebrations might draw. When an entire community starts trying to make itself invisible, that tells you something that no disputed statistic ever could. Some did more than try to disappear. They left. In the months after the collapse, rights groups recorded thousands of minority families slipping across the border into India, abandoning homes and land that their families had held for generations. It was the latest entry in a long, grim arithmetic. Hindus were around 13% of Bangladesh's population at independence in the early 1970s. By the most recent census, they had fallen below 8. Every spasm of violence accelerates that same quiet exodus. The killings were horrifying enough. The response from the top was its own kind of wound. On October 2025, the head of the interim government, Muhammad Yunus, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate brought in to heal the country, publicly dismissed the alarm over minority attacks as fake news. And that phrase did more than insult the dead. It told every mob in the country that no one at the top was even bothering to count. If you want to understand which nations are quietly coming apart while the world's attention is fixed somewhere else, that's precisely what this channel exists to track. Subscribe to Fall of Nations and turn on notifications, because everything so far has just been the setup. What the country actually decided once it finally got the chance to vote is the part that almost nobody saw coming. For 18 months, the world watched Bangladesh slide and assumed that it already knew how the story would end. The Islamists would ascend, the minorities would flee, and the revolution would be hijacked. But then, on February 12, 2026, Bangladesh held an election, and the result detonated every easy assumption. The Islamists lost. Not narrowly, decisively. The Bangladesh Nationalist Party, the BNP, a secular nationalist heavyweight and the old rival of Hasina's party, won a landslide, taking roughly 2/3 of parliament with 209 seats. Jamaat-e-Islami, the party that everyone had watched claw its way back from the dead, finished a distant second. So the panic was overblown? Well, not quite, because here's the number that complicates the relief. Jamaat won 68 seats, the highest total in the party's entire history. With its 11-party Islamist alliance, the count climbed to 77. So for the first time ever, Jamaat won seats in the capital itself, 6 of them in Dhaka. A party that had been banned, jailed, and written off as a relic had just posted the best electoral result of its life and installed itself as the official opposition in parliament. So how did a party with that history climb so high? Well, part of that answer is that Hasina's own voters had nowhere left to go. With the Awami League banned, millions of its former supporters scattered, and surveys found a striking number drifting toward Jamaat, of all places. partly as a protest and partly because the disciplined Islamists looked like the only force that was capable of standing up to the BNP. The campaign itself was awash in manipulation. Election officials reported detecting tens of thousands of pieces of AI-generated disinformation in the run-up to the vote, much of it aimed squarely at the top party leaders. The new Bangladesh, it turned out, would be fought over with deepfakes. And the people who actually made the revolution? The students. The youth movement that toppled Hasina formed a party of their own, the National Citizen Party. They won 6 seats out of nearly 300. I ought to read that sentence again because it's the whole story compressed into a single result. The secular idealists who risked their lives to overthrow a dictator were all but erased. The disciplined Islamist machine that never fired a shot during the uprising walked away with a historic permanent platform. And the secular old guard, the BNP, inherited the country. And there's one more decision baked into that vote. Hasina's party, the Awami League, was banned from running at all. So the election that looked from a distance like a triumph of democracy was also an election with the largest party in the country's modern history struck off the ballot before a single vote was cast. The new prime minister was sworn in on February 17th of 2026. Tariq Rahman, the BNP leader, returning from 17 years of exile to take the office that his own mother once held. Alongside the vote, Bangladeshis approved the July Charter in a referendum, locking in term limits and a redesigned parliament. So, which is it? Did radical Islam take over Bangladesh or not? The honest answer is the unsettling one. It did not seize the state. It did something more durable. It converted a moment of pure chaos into a permanent seat at the table. Legal, elected, and almost impossible to ban again. The fever broke at the ballot box, but the infection did not. And the damage done during those 18 months refused to stay inside Bangladesh's borders. The first place it spilled into was the relationship with the giant next door. India shares a long border with Bangladesh and a deep permanent nervousness about whatever happens inside it. As the attacks on Hindus mounted, India's government openly accused Bangladesh of downplaying a disturbing pattern of violence against minorities. Bangladesh shot back that India was stoking the outrage for its own ends. The dispute hardened into something concrete. Both sides suspended parts of their visa services. Cricket, the one passion that the two nations share equally, became a casualty, with a Bangladeshi player barred from India's marquee league and Bangladesh boycotting a tournament in reply. Two neighbors who genuinely need each other had stopped trusting each other. And then you have the route to Europe. For several years now, Bangladesh has quietly become the single largest source of irregular migrants crossing the central Mediterranean into Italy. In both 2024 and 2025, Bangladeshis were the top nationality on that deadly route. Roughly 20,000 arrivals in 2025 alone, close to a third of everyone who made the crossing. The journey itself is a brutal piece of machinery. Most of these migrants do not sneak out under the cover of darkness. They fly to Libya on valid passports, often believing that they're headed to legitimate jobs, and only there discover that the real route runs across open water. That cost can climb toward tens of thousands of dollars, paid to a chain of brokers that begins in some Bangladeshi village and ends with armed militias controlling the Libyan coast. Families sell land and take on crushing debt to fund it. Many never arrive at all. It would be easy and wrong to fold this neatly into the extremism story. The evidence simply doesn't support it. The people on those boats are overwhelmingly economic migrants, young men chasing work, funneled out by debt and broker networks that existed long before Hasina ever fell. Researchers who have studied the corridor in depth are blunt about it. The vast majority have no connection to terrorism whatsoever. This is just a story about a broken economy exporting its desperate young, not an ideology that's exporting fighters. But the two pressures still feed that same fire. A country that cannot employ its youth, cannot protect its minorities, and cannot police its own militants, well, that's a country that generates outflows of every kind. Workers, refugees, and, at the very margins, the handful that European security services do quietly worry about. Those agencies are watching the route closely for exactly that reason. The boats themselves are mostly a humanitarian and economic story. The instability that launches them, that's a political one. And instability, unlike a single boat, does not stay where it started. And that is the thread running through all of this. The overcrowding, the dead rivers, the burning temples, the historic Islamist vote, the boats landing on Italian beaches. None of these are separate crises. They're symptoms of a single underlying failure, a state that lost its grip, and a set of forces that were ready, organized, and waiting to take full advantage the moment it did. Which leaves the only question that actually matters now. Could any of this been stopped? Look back across the sequence, and the uncomfortable truth is that nearly every turning point was a choice, not an accident. The ban on the Islamist Party was lifted by a decision. The militants were bailed by a decision. The mobs went unpunished by a decision, or rather by the decision to do nothing. When the head of the government called the alarm fake news, that too was a choice. Countries don't slide into this kind of place by gravity alone. They're steered here, one reasonable sounding step at a time. That is what makes gradual change so dangerous. No single decision looked like a catastrophe on the day it was made. Freeing political prisoners sounds like justice. Unbanning a party sounds like democracy. Letting a transitional government find its footing sounds like patience. It's only when you stack the steps one on top of another that the real shape begins to appear. And by then, the door is already open and the room is already full. Bangladesh did not become a different country overnight. It became one in slow motion, while a watching world quietly reassured itself that the worst could not happen in a place that it had filed away under cheap clothing and not much else. Other countries are watching, or at least should be. The ingredients that made Bangladesh combustible, a population with no jobs, an economy balanced on a single fragile industry, institutions hollowed out from within, they're not unique to one delta in South Asia. They're spread across a dozen states right across the map. Bangladesh simply reached the future first. The election offered a reprieve. A secular party holds power, the constitution still stands, but an Islamist movement that was supposed to be a relic now sits in parliament with the strongest result it ever recorded. A permanent voice and the patience to wait for the next opening. And the young secular dreamers who started it all have nearly vanished from the chamber that they bled to create. So here's what we want to know from you. When a country's institutions fail all at once, is the most organized force always the one that wins the wreckage, no matter what the voters actually wanted?